I regretfully had a sexual incident with a female high school senior in the church.
He tells the world that it had occurred.
And everybody stands, and they give him a standing ovation.
A jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
It may seem surprising that a self-professed moral majority would end up supporting a candidate who has bragged about assaulting women. But if you look inside their own communities, you can see how for decades they have propped up men who have abused power and have excused all kinds of harm, all kinds of abuses for the sake of that power. The ends justifies the means.
I will fight even harder for Christians with 4 more years in the White House. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
We wake up tomorrow in a Christian nation. Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
Macho power is not what Jesus calls for. Jesus himself did not operate in that way. Jesus was gentle. He was humble, particularly in his relationship with women. In that way, he told us men what we are to be like.
And I think what we have to grapple with again is that the reality that those of us who are raising our voices are not calling for a departure from Christ, but rather a return to who Christ really is.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Kristin, welcome back to the show for episode 2 over here. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's really great to be back.
I'm really excited to talk about your film For Our Daughters. And of course, when the trailer dropped, I had to go straight to the comments and see what people were saying. And one of the first comments I saw was, why are we getting political with this? And why are we trying to go after conservative politics? Can you explain to me why you, a historian and the New York Times bestselling author of Jesus and John Wayne, would be interested in drawing a connection between evangelicalism and conservative politics? It seems like that's outside your territory.
Yeah, I like the setup, but I saw that comment popped up rather suited. I really loved how many women themselves answered it, and I think in a way that would be similar to the survivors themselves who participated in this film. They knew exactly what they were getting into, and they knew I was very upfront about the political framing of the film because I came to the entire subject of the abuse of women in evangelical churches through researching this broader political history. So I was researching the book that became Jesus and John Wayne. I was tracing the origins of this very militant view of masculinity that I had first really encountered and started researching in the early 2000s already. I'm working on this for a long time before Jesus and John Wayne came out. And this was the era of Mark Driscoll and Doug Wilson was starting to make some waves and get on more of the kind of national radar, at least in evangelical churches, and the John Eldridge, height of his popularity, and so on. And so I researched in the early 2000s, and then I set the project aside. I had other stuff going on, but I didn't stop paying attention. And early on, I was actually intrigued by connections between this conception of militant masculinity and foreign policy. Because it was the Iraq War, and evangelicals were far and above more likely to support that war, condone torture, support aggressive foreign policy. And that was actually my entry point into this whole conversation. How do cultural understandings of gender shape foreign policy? And then very quickly, it brought me into shape domestic politics as well, this culture wars politics. But I also started to notice, even though I set the project aside, I didn't stop paying attention to many of the men in these spaces who were promoting this militant masculinity. And what I saw is one after another became implicated in abuse scandals, sexual abuse, abuse of power, either directly as perpetrators or covering up for their friends. who were perpetrators. And so fast forward to the fall of 2016, the release of the Access Hollywood tapes, where we have Trump on camera bragging about assaulting women. And the whole media, evangelical world too, was like, oh, surely this is a bridge too far for evangelical supporters. But of course it was not, still is not. And everybody's asking, how could they betray their values? And I knew that was the wrong question to ask. This was not a betrayal of their values. We have to understand what those values actually are. And I had an inkling because of this earlier research. So one of the first things I did in the fall of 2016, when I decided I need to pull out that old research and write a book, I consulted a lawyer to see, because I knew these women's stories had to be a part of this broader political history. But this was pre-Me Too, pre-Church Too. I was wondering about liability. Can I include these stories that I have just been hearing on blogs and in small spaces, but I'm hearing so many of them? And, I was given kind of the green light, but check back, legally. And then Me Too happened, and then Church Too happened. And then the national media started paying attention. And then those stories were out there to be used, right? They were vetted and so I had been tracking this for such a long time. And I knew those stories were a part of this broader system. I knew they showed what happened when you give men unrestrained power, when you prop up male authority, when you embrace an ends justifies the means mentality, and when you apply ideas of submission and authority and power and dominance to sexuality and when you're trying to control the women in your spaces. So I just knew these had to belong together. I kept them together in Jesus and John Wayne. And right now, in our current political moment, I feel very secure in the fact that these topics should be addressed in the same breath.
When it came time to actually work on For Our Daughters, how did that all fall into place? Is that something you just actively pursued right after Jesus and John Wayne? Was it something where you were approached with like, hey, here's an opportunity? Like, what was kind of the direction there?
Yeah, no, I will say, as a writer, as a historian, making a movie was nowhere on my bucket list, like not at all. I was not eager to do so. I'm focused on my next book and all the other things. And I actually don't love being out in the media, even though I end up there a lot. And so, no, this was not something I wanted to do. I had a number of filmmakers kind of approach me and toyed with some ideas, wasn't quite sure. And then Carl Byker, who's the director of this, came along, and we really connected right up front, and we had a similar vision. And this was just a kind of a hypothetical. What might this look like? And so we started toying with maybe a series, Jesus and John Wayne, or maybe it would be a feature documentary. Both of those options, by the way, are still on the table. But then we started just the preliminary research. He said, well, let's start with some of these women's voices. And so we started with that. And, I think part of what happened is I was really blown away by these stories. I mean, I am too. Every time I hear them, it is just so shocking. And I am so deeply disturbed, and I'm also filled with such admiration for these women. And I think the power of their stories convinced Carl, as we were at that point kind of shifting to maybe we're going to do a feature documentary instead of a, kind of 4-part limited series. We aren't going to be able to use all of these incredible stories in a feature doc, which has to cover so much more, right? Jesus and John Wayne. This is just one chapter, the last chapter. And so he felt this powerful sense of calling, really, to bring these stories to a broader audience. Because for those of us, yourself included, who work inside these spaces, who work with survivors, who listen to these stories, who work to amplify these voices, we are familiar with these dynamics, right? And it's easy to forget how so many people, including people in the pews of evangelical churches, have not been confronted with these stories. There have been all sorts of efforts to discredit these women, to cover up the abuse, to blame them, and to blame them for interfering with the church's witness, right? And so a lot of this has not trickled down to the pews. So really, one of the motivations for this project was we have this incredible footage of exactly the voices that we want people to hear. Let's offer it. Let's put it together in a documentary short. So this is a 30-minute documentary. powerful stories, and we wanted the moment felt urgent. We wanted to get it out to shape the conversation around church abuse and around, frankly, the political choices that are before us in this historic moment. And we wanted to just add their voices to the mix. And then once we finish with this, we'll get back to pursuing a larger project. But we wanted this as a standalone in this moment.
You mentioned power, and I was flipping back through Jesus and John Wayne just before the interview, just to look for any connection points. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is around the section where we talked about the independent Baptist world, which I had copious underlines for our last interview. You mentioned that for a community that believes in the existence of sin, conservative evangelicals were curiously nonchalant about the dangers of unchecked power when that power is placed in the hands of a patriarch. Watching For Our Daughters and hearing Pastor Len Vanderzee talk about the last and most powerful temptation of Christ being power, like the connection was so strong. And that quote from him was like the jaw drop moment for me watching it. What were those moments for you where you had your kind of jaw drop moment where it's like, I knew this, but hearing one of these speakers say it in this way, like connected things in ways that I never could have articulated or hoped to
Oh my
articulate?
goodness. I mean, almost every sentence. I was just so impressed with, Christa Brown, Tiffany Thigpen, Jules Woodson, Cait West, all of them sharing different aspects of this kind of bigger picture. And I honestly, I was surprised. I remember when we were setting up for Krista's interview, and I asked her how many of these she'd done, right? Because I've kind of made the documentary rounds myself, and she said none. And I was shocked.
Yeah.
Right. She's given 1 or 2 interviews, but the documentaries haven't been produced. If you know anything about making documentaries, it's a lot. You can be filming, you can be working on a project, you still need to get it distributed and so on. So, it just really shocked me. Honestly, so many of the things that they say. I think with Christa, when she talked about, to get to the title, one of the inspirations for the title of film, there's more than one, was when she saw her own daughter at the age she was when she was abused. That was the first time it really clicked. Like, she wasn't to blame, even though they had blamed her, even though she was made to apologize to her abuser's wife, right? She was not to blame. She could see her own daughter, and that just opened things up for her. In the case of Tiffany, it was seeing that her abuser had gone on to abuse other girls, and that they just, given what they were up against in the power of his supporters, Jerry Vines and the SBC, that these victims didn't stand a chance, these little girls. And that's what made her say, enough is enough. Sign me up, put me in. Right. And her life has been, all of these survivors, their lives have been just turned upside down, and they have faced so much ongoing abuse, demonization because of what they've said. I also love Rachael Denhollander's contributions. And so much of what she said corresponded absolutely with my own research into the theology of submission and abuse. Like, we just have independently come to the same conclusions, and she is so powerful and articulate. And then one more word I'll say, you brought up Len Vanderzee. He's actually my own pastor, right? There's a reason you probably don't know his name. He's not famous. But when the director said, we really should have a man's voice in here, we should talk about, that this isn't the only way to be a Christian and so on, and kind of gave some of the usual suspects, which of these guys should we ask to come into this film? And that's when I said, well, how about we not go with the usual suspects? How about we just ask my pastor? This was my pastor for years when I was in graduate school, and now he's the pastor of my own local church again. And he said, sure. And I thought it was very important to hear, this is the Christianity that has shaped me. It is a very different understanding of power. To be a Christian is to offer yourselves up, to follow a Christ who offered himself up, who divested himself of power. And it is no easy thing to do. And we fail all the time, right? Calvinist here, but it is what we are called to do. And we are not called to give into the temptation of grasping for power, and certainly not baptizing that and pretending like that is a godly and righteous thing to do.
So you're not creating this to attack Christianity. Get that question out of the way.
Not to attack Christianity, but do you know what? If some people feel attacked, I mean, they ought to look at why. And I think a question that might come up is, okay, you use some extreme examples, but in my research for Jesus and John Wayne, and in fact, a theme that runs throughout the book is, what is the relationship between the mainstream and the fringe? Those with more extremist views, with more extremist practices, and then the quote unquote mainstream. And what even is the mainstream? And I think if we look at the last 15, 20 years or so of evangelical history, this is a question we have to be asking. Is Christianity today, which was always kind of held out as that's the mainstream, right? Wheaton College, Christianity Today, National Association of Evangelicals, that's mainstream, and anything else, Doug Wilson, that's fringe.
Fringe, yeah.
How's that going for us? Where are we now? Who actually wields the power in these communities? What happens if you vocally speak out against Doug Wilson, if you vocally speak out against abuse generally in churches, even if you do so working through proper channels, even if you identify as a complementarian, even if you are a pastor of a conservative denomination and this is the one issue you speak out on, what happens to you? Right? And that's what we have to grapple with. Is this the fringe? I think it's not. Is everybody equally implicated? Absolutely not. But I hope that people who feel uncomfortable with some of what they see here will ask themselves, what they can do in their spaces if they have been working in their spaces. And here's what I will guarantee. If you have not been working to eliminate abuse, to address abuse through various free forms, if you have not been amplifying the voices of survivors, you have not been hearing the stories. Survivors know who to go to. And as soon as you go public in any fashion, amplifying the voice of a survivor, advocating for abuse, you are going to start getting emails, messages, and you're going to hear more and more stories. So we have this disconnect right now in our Christian spaces between those who have ears to hear and those who say, I've never encountered this. It's not happening. It's not a problem in my church. Hopefully, one of the things this film can do is make people a little bit more curious, a little bit more open to wondering which stories have not been reaching them, and to see what they can do to ensure, if they are so sure that this is not happening in their own spaces, to ensure that it continues that way, and to see what they can do to lift up survivors in spaces where they're being beaten down.
Yeah, obviously my last question was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think it points to a piece that critics of projects like this constantly throw out, which is there's a hatred for Christianity. There's a hatred for this faith group. And I really appreciated, especially in Krista's segments, which I'm blown away that she hasn't done more documentaries because she's so well-spoken. And I mean,
Incredible.
her book alone is incredible. But one of the quotes from her that was used from the For Such a Time as This rally is, this massive institutional enablement of horror must be addressed on an equally massive scale. And I think the attack is really on the institution. I saw a stat the other day. I think the SBC has spent about $12 million in the last couple of years fighting back against sexual abuse survivors. Like, that is not Christianity as I know it. And I know it's certainly not Christianity as you know it. It is these institutions. And with the institutions in mind, there's so many villains, right? Like, there's so many Doug Wilsons. There's so many people that have covered up massive amounts of abuse. Sitting down to do a documentary that's, about 30 minutes, how do you pick which villains to highlight? Because there's so many within these institutions.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I will say, even for the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne, it was initially twice as long. And I remember vividly my editor's critique. He called that chapter bloated and undisciplined. And it was a little insulting, but I thought, blame the men. There's just too many of them to track. Yep. And so I ended up cutting whole sections, cutting multiple instances out. And for this film, I actually wasn't deciding which perpetrators to include. I went by which survivors to include. And the way I went with that choice was, frankly, it was very important for me in this project, knowing the ruthlessness of attacks against survivors who speak out, I didn't want to woo somebody into the public spotlight who didn't know exactly what they would have coming to them. I wanted people who knew exactly what they were up against, who and not just like intellectually had experienced it, because I have been so incredibly grieved to watch the vitriol, the demonization, disparagement against these women who, did everything right. They were obedient. They were innocent. They brought it to their pastors, to their church authorities. They brought it, to help other women, thinking, well, of course they're going to want to know about this evil. Of course they're going to want to fix this and make sure this happens again. And no, that is not what happened over and over again. So it was important to me to choose survivors who had already gone through the fire.
Yeah.
Because just as an act of kind of moral conscience, I did not want to expose anybody to that who wasn't already there on her own terms.
Yeah.
And so that's really how we chose which survivors to include. And then it tends to be SBC heavy, in part because, these, it's the largest Protestant denomination. It's kind of the heart of conservative white evangelicalism, but also because it has been more public now. And so there's been a lot of news stories. The SBC, ran their own investigation. We have the Houston Chronicle. And so I think at least 3 of the stories are SBC related. Cait West actually comes from, hers was more spiritual abuse than sexual abuse. And she comes from the Christian patriarchy movement. And her family, her dad came under the influence of Doug Wilson and his teachings, and then took the kids out of school, moved out to the middle of nowhere, and raised her as a stay-at-home daughter. And she has had to work her way out of that space. Her entire story couldn't get squeezed into the 30 minutes, but I thought she could explain so well the kind of teachings and the cultural formation that goes on inside families that embrace different levels of this kind of Christian patriarchy and what is a girl's duty. And then you can see how that sets them up in ways that it's very difficult for them to confront abuse, very difficult for them to address what actually happens to them for theological reasons, cultural reasons, and these power dynamics.
That's kind of a great benefit too of interviewing people who have shared their story in very public. I think each of them have written extensively, and done, or at least done interviews that have extensively detailed their story.
Yeah.
When you're sitting in the edit room, you're not going, or are we cutting? Like, if anything, I think this is also a teaser for all of their stories individually. Like, I'm hoping people watching will go, let me get Cait West's book. Let me read Baptistland. Let me go in and read What Is a Girl Worth? Like, there are so many layers there that people can dig into. And I definitely echo what you said about there being the bloat of covering all of these villain figures. I got a comment on a video I just did about one person and all the connections. And one of the comments was, this is like drinking from a fire hose. Like, there's so much stuff. It's so hard to follow. There's so many connections.
Yeah.
And I said, that's kind of the point, right?
It
like,
is exactly
there's
the
that
point.
many scandals to this one
Yes.
person. Probably only need to watch about 3 minutes of this video to know they weren't that great a person. So,
Right.
definitely.
No, my editor also had another comment about the book as a whole. He's like, Kristin, do we really have to hear about all of these guys? And I was like, okay, I'll take a few out. And I just kept trimming. But also inside, my little voice said, we actually do. Right. We actually do, because that's the point. It's this whole system. It's the whole culture that is fostered. And so there's no escape. And so many victims think that it is only them. Right. And that's one of the things that for this movie to do is just to help women know, if they have found themselves in these situations, it is not their fault. And they are not the only one. And what happened to them wasn't a one-off. It wasn't an aberration. There are reasons for this. And I want them to know what they were up against and why, when they tried to speak out and when they tried to bring it to their church, when they tried to make sure it wouldn't happen again and didn't succeed, There are reasons for that because they were up against incredible, powerful forces. And in many cases, they really didn't stand a chance. And until you expose that for what it is and expose these networks and expose these deeply embedded teachings, it is not going to change. If we can change it now, that still is a very open question. But we're not going to even be able to know where to start if we don't understand just how deeply enmeshed this culture is.
I was actually talking to your docu-sibling, Chad Harris, from Shiny Happy People, and who said hi, by the way. So I should get that out of the way now while I'm thinking of it. But, we were talking about that recently in our conversation where I said, you and I are in this more than most people. Like I said, he's digging into IBLP more than most. I'm in the kind of fundamentalist world far more than most. You're certainly in this far more than most, studying this. And there are still things that confound us and shock us and surprise us. And I told him, I said, imagine somebody who's never dipped their toe in that water. If you can put yourself back in that headspace, you're a 16-year-old girl at a church who doesn't know who a Bill Gothard is, or they don't know who Doug Wilson is, but their dad reads him. Like, that's such a scary thing. And it can be difficult to know how to help those individuals. And I think, like you said, hearing other stories is kind of the best first step. What's your ultimate key takeaway? Like, if someone's watching this, if they are that person who doesn't know all the names, they don't know all the people, but they relate to the emotion of it, what do you hope they walk away from this documentary with?
First and foremost, I just want them to sit with these stories. I will say, in preparation for interviews of this film, I was just listening to an interview with Rob Downen on the SBC investigation, right? And just detailing that. And I have to say, as somebody, like you, who's been completely, in this mix for years now, I was fighting back tears hearing the stories again. And I think that is the first and most appropriate response is to be affected, is to put yourself in that space and try to, I think not coincidentally, empathy. Empathy is a term that has really come under fire in these conservative evangelical spaces in a way that's kind of wild.
People have written articles about the sin of empathy.
The sin of empathy. I wonder why. I will say empathize with these women, try to understand, and here Rachael Denhollander is so strong on this. What is so deeply distorted and twisted about all of this? And if you are a Christian, and if you feel like this is attacking the church, I was like, no. Let's, what is the church to you? What is Christianity to you? Who is Jesus to you? And is this film what's attacking the thing that you hold dear? Or are the abusers and enablers the ones who have attacked what you hold dear? And I think in almost every case, people will understand and acknowledge that, yes, the latter, that's what it is. And if that's the case, what is your call? What is your call? Is it to try to brush these stories under the rug yet again? Try to get these women to just shut up so that the gospel looks, happy and inviting to outsiders? They're going to find out. They're going to find out one way or another. Or is it to clean house and to make sure that your church and that Christianity in this country is known as a place of harbor, as a place where the weary can come and find rest, as a place where love and justice are what you are going to experience. And when somebody runs afoul of those things, that is addressed, it is called out as wrong, it is called out as evil, and measures are put in place to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I know Rachael Denhollander has said, that she can see how dark this world is and the abuse because she sees the light of truth and what things ought to be, the way things ought to be, and how far short this falls. So I would encourage viewers to sit with that, and then to think, what have they done that may have inadvertently been complicit in this? How have they enabled these systems to go on? And what can they do going forward? What would that look like? Would it look like amplifying the voice of a survivor? Would it look like implementing safe church practices in your local congregation? Would it look like just having the back of somebody who's really taking heat for the advocacy work that they are doing? And I guarantee you start doing any of those things, it will change you and it will give you eyes to see. So I would love to see people start in small ways, and very quickly those are going to grow into some pretty big important ways.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the fringe. The argument is always the fringe is the ones doing the worst things. And Christa even addresses that. There's people that say, well, I didn't abuse anyone. She says, yes, you did, like by perpetuating the system. And I have to say, as someone whose faith is in limbo, and a lot of that due to just being in the world that I'm in and digging apart these things, I certainly feel as though some of the best Christians that I know have been pushed to the fringe by an institution that's protecting itself. It's interesting to me talking to you or a Beth Alsenbar or Scott Coley or David Gushee, or like all these people who, when they talk about Christianity, I'm like, I'll walk the altar right now. This sounds amazing and beautiful. But then you go to like Twitter after the interview and you see all of these people on their profile just attacking them, who are like the leaders of quote unquote Christianity. It's really, really frustrating. And it's something where I don't understand the end goal of the institution. I don't understand, even from a PR perspective, strip away spirituality. It's like you're pushing so many people away. Like the SBC is hemorrhaging people.
Yes, it is.
And yet they still won't, even for the sake of keeping their people, they won't stand with survivors. And that's the worst possible reason they could have to do it, and they still won't do it. It's confusing. That's not a question, but it's just a personal.
Well, I think it raises a question. What is their goal?
No.
Is it the gospel? That word gets thrown around so often in those spaces. What the heck does that even mean? Right? What is the gospel? What are they converting people to? Right? And I think that we have to put that question out there. I will say too, having experienced my share of attacks, I've said this multiple times, that nothing brings the hate into my inbox and onto my feed like when I speak out about the abuse of women in Christian spaces. Nothing even comes close. And I only get a tiny share of what abuse survivors themselves actually get. And other people see this. I mean, I had an acquaintance come into my DMs this week after seeing what was coming at me. And he's an atheist. He used to be a Christian, walked away years ago. And he just said, Kristin, why don't you just leave? Like, what? It's a lot better on the other side. Like, you don't have to put up with that abuse. You can just walk away, right? And that's what it looks like from the outside. And, honestly, many abuse survivors, not all, have left the church. Some have left the church, quote unquote, the church. Some have left the faith entirely. And when I was asking participants if they'd be willing to do this project, a couple of them actually said, I don't know if you'll want me, because I'm pretty ambivalent about where I am with my faith right now, or I just can't call myself a Christian. And if that's not the narrative that you want, and I was just like, I don't care where you end up. I want the truth. I want the truth. If you have ended up still inside the church, if you have ended up in a burn it all down space, I want your story. Like, I'm not trying to curate this. I want your story because I want everybody to hear your story, the true story, and not a carefully crafted, curated one that's going to not offend some people or it's going to win over some people. I just want to lead with the truth. And then the rest of us, we're going to be picking up the pieces and trying to make sense of things and figuring out what that means going forward.
I'm curious here, as we get near the end, I keep finding myself asking the question, I asked Adam Kinsinger recently about the political climate. And I said, it feels to me, as someone who's not an expert, we're kind of past the point of no return in some spaces here. Like, it seems like it only gets worse from here. But I also want to be an optimist, in some ways that change can happen. Like, that's kind of the hope of advocacy work, is like, that's what's going to take place. And he said something like he's a long optimist. Like, in the short term, very pessimistic, but in the long game, he's optimistic. I'm curious for you, like, obviously you've put out a book, which I haven't shown on screen yet, so there we go. You've been creating a lot of great, I didn't want to say content, you've been creating a lot of detailed academic work about our history and how not to repeat it. And many people are still business as usual. Do you find
82%
yourself,
latest poll. Yep.
do you find yourself struggling to be optimistic about the future? Or when you sit down with a Christa and a Cait and you see these people raising, the next generation, influencing the next generation of daughters, do you feel an optimism that in the long game, like what's happening now, this fringe is going to grow and take over this giant that is the SBC and, the patriarchal movement?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic for changing, what people call the church. And if you notice, I'm always kind of, putting that in kind of, scare quotes, the church. That's a term that's thrown around and in ways that I'm always uncomfortable with. Who gets to define and own and speak for the church and on behalf of the church? And I'm not optimistic for change. Years ago, maybe, with the abuse of faith, Houston Chronicle piece, with the SBC investigation, and then here we are, right? I think one name got added this week to the list, like is the first one, right?
The hope gets beaten out of you very quickly.
It gets beaten out of you. And then I will say also, as a historian, my outside field was 20th century Germany. I've studied the history of authoritarianism, and knowing that history makes me deeply concerned. And I'm not alone. Any historian who is familiar with how authoritarianism works and what leads to an authoritarian takeover, we are on that track.
Yeah. Well,
And
Gushy's entire recent book
absolutely.
was
Absolutely. And we're just, when we're focused, as we must be, on the next election. And then, okay, the next election, now the midterms, and now the next election. This is exactly how things happen. Come close, take a step back. Come close, take a step back, until suddenly it's gone, right? Democracy is gone. And once it's gone, it is incredibly hard to get back. And I see us in that very precarious space right now. And so I also am not optimistic in the short term. But what does give me hope, because everybody always wants to know, what gives you hope, Kristin? The hope that I have and hold and carry with me comes from the resilience that I see in Christa, in Jules, in Tiffany, in Cait, and Rachael. And here's the other thing I will promise. If you start speaking out on behalf of those who have been victimized in this context or in others, right, you should expect, especially if you're in conservative Christian spaces, to be attacked. It will come, and you will pay some real costs in terms of relationships, maybe in terms of leaving your church. It will be rough. And you will also connect with incredible people who are doing this work, some inside the church, some outside the church. And going forward, I think what's very important for us is, yes, focus on the near term, on victory, whatever that looks like, on forestalling this, on safeguarding our democracy, on protecting women through, this next election and what follows after that. But we also have to work to cultivate this strength and resilience in each of us, precisely because we do not know what comes ahead. And if we are in a space where democracy is eroded, how are we going to, that's not the end of the story. That's in some ways the beginning of the story, right? The prologue is done, and then the story really begins. How are we preparing ourselves in our local spaces and in our national space to have the kind of courage and strategy and strength and resilience to do what next needs to be done?
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think it's something that, as we, well, I'll say it. I watched The Matrix for the first time last year, and that was like, I'm not going to be the guy that drops the Matrix analogy, but it's so
Go for
apt.
it.
And it wasn't for me. I definitely didn't have the Andrew Tate reading of The Matrix, but the thing that really stood out to me in the whole movie is when they first unplug him and he says, "Why do my eyes hurt?" And I say, "You've never used them before." And I think it's such an apt description for the feeling that I have as somebody who is feeling, again, like you said, once you speak out, you get ousted to, like, immediately out of your faith community, and then seeing it is so painful and hard. But you do have this group of people around you that can help you walk you through that. And I think that was what was so incredible. And look, I started this show like 4 years ago, and it's amazing to me that I've been able to sit down with a Christa Brown who's been doing this for decades. I've been able to sit down with people who've been working at this for a long time. And depending on the day, that can be discouraging to go like, we should be further than we are now. But it also is this thing where there's this community that's kind of building slowly that I think has created something just new. I think a lot of people have given up on we need to take back over this thing. It's like, we don't even want this institution anymore. Like, what else is there? And I'm excited to see what that looks like, even though, right now it can be difficult to know exactly what that looks like. Last question. I have to ask it. And I know you're going to get this a million more times, but I'm early on in your press tour for this, so I can ask it. What's next on the horizon for you? Where do we go from here?
Well, the project that I put on temporary hold to do this film, it's my next book, and I'm 2 chapters away from being done, and my editor is eagerly awaiting that finished manuscript. So it is called Live, Laugh, Love, and it's a cultural history of white Christian womanhood. And so it's kind of the complement, if you will, to Jesus and John Wayne, looking at the kind of Christian women's consumer culture, from Christian romance to multi-level marketing to Hallmark movies, and looking at how that has inculcated political, economic, and religious values throughout American culture, not just in evangelical spaces.
I'm looking forward to it, and I'm really excited for our daughters. If you're listening to this on the day of release, it comes out tomorrow. If you're listening to it any other time, it's out right now, so you can just stop this interview and go right into it. Or if you've already watched it, this is a great companion piece, hopefully, to it. But thank you so much for doing this interview, for having the conversation. I know you're extremely busy, and I know your editor hates me for taking away from writing. So I really appreciate it.
He doesn't even know I'm doing this.
Okay, we'll keep it on the down low. He'll be listening in a few days like, what? But thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And I hope it's not the last time we chat. Maybe again for this next book.
Would love to. Thank you so much.